So what I'm going to present is an overview of case control study design. And it will talk mainly about three things, which are the basic designs of case control studies, how to calculate basic measures of association, and how to identify potential biases. Now, when we think about case control study, usually they are midpoint between studies that provide a low level of evidence and high level of evidence. So the lowest level of evidence usually comes from anecdote, from expert opinion and case report, and of course the highest level of evidence comes from RCT. So the case control study is at mid-level. It's an observational study. It's not experimental, and it is analytical type of study that analyzes association between variables. Irrespective where it lies, the case, even if it's a middle-level evidence, we have to think about the case control as a design that provides us really with good results, provided that the study is designed with high internal validity. So the quality is a key issue, and internal validity is really the truth. So irrespective where it lies, it should be well designed so it can provide us with accurate results. Now, what is the purpose of case control study? It assesses the relationship. So what's the relationship between an exposure and the disease? So it's not a descriptive study, it's an analytical type of study, and it identifies, we use it to identify potential risk factor. Now, if you need like a nice chapter on case control design, I provided you with a link. It's nice to read and very easy to read, and covers everything that I will be covering right now. So case control, sorry, did I miss anything? Okay. So case control study, so the outcome has already occurred. So what Schultz referred to as research in reverse. So already your outcome has occurred, and now you'd like to see what are the risk factors for these outcomes. So there are three steps in doing it. So first I have to start selecting cases, and the cases are the people, the participants who already have developed the outcome. The second stage, or parallel to that, I have to select people without the outcome that I would call controls. And then, taking the cases and the control, I would look at the exposure. So I would assess the exposure status once I determine my cases who have the outcome and controls who don't have the outcome. Okay? So why a case control study? So why am I interested in a case control study in particular? When do I use it? It's specifically for rare outcomes. So you will tell me what is a rare outcome or rare disease. Usually as a rule of thumb, the rare outcome is less than 5%. But it's not only for rare outcomes. We use it also for diseases that are of long latency, so they take time to develop. So sometimes having a cohort and to follow up people who are healthy until they develop is cumbersome. It might not be feasible, or you don't have the resources. So you take already people who have already developed the disease. And something that I did not mention here, usually you use case control study for diseases where people seek care. So they are usually, we can find these cases in healthcare settings. We use a case control study when we have one outcome of interest, so we're interested in one disease. However, we'd like to see assess multiple exposures, so more than one risk factor. Sometimes when you start, you don't have any idea about a particular type of exposure, but you'd like to explore what kind of factors are related to a particular outcome. So you're exploring. Again, this is a good way to start with the case control study. And sometimes when you have so much evidence about a particular exposure, such as smoking, I wouldn't go into a cohort study on tobacco and another cancer. I would start, it's too compelling, so I can start with people who already have a particular cancer, and then I ask them about smoking. And particularly case control study are suitable for outbreak investigation. So you have an outbreak investigation for gastroenteritis in a particular area in Lebanon. Already you have gastroenteritis, people have reported to the Ministry of Health, and we like to see what is the source. You take these cases, we know that they have gastroenteritis, we find controls, and we investigate what is the source of the outbreak. So this is very good and very quick. So example for a research question where we could use a case control study is to study association between hemorrhagic stroke and hormone replacement therapy in postmenopausal women. Investigate water pipe smoking as a risk factor for esophageal adenocarcinoma. Again, you're looking at stuff that are rare or where we can only identify in a hospital like hemorrhagic stroke. Investigate factor associated with incidence knee osteoarthritis. Okay, incident knee osteoarthritis is not very common. Determine risk factor associated with brucellosis outbreak in Shuf district. This is an outbreak that one of our students have conducted, and now she's CRI, is Layla now with CRI or with SHARP, and this is, it was part of her practicum in the Masters of Public Health. So this is an illustration. So what I'm going to do is, as I'm going through the concept, I'm going to always refer to an article which is case control study of smoking and bladder cancer risk emergent pattern over time. So to illustrate the concept, so we will see how in the article they approach every single concept I'm presenting, okay? So why this particular case control study? So they're looking at smoking and bladder cancer. So don't we know enough about smoking and bladder cancer? So do we need another study? So given that we know smoking and cancer, so I don't want to go into a cohort. So I identify bladder cancer cases and I do a case control study. But specifically this particular case control was done because we have contradictory result with respect to bladder cancer and exposure to environmental tobacco smoke, what we used to call passive smoking. So they wanted to look at passive smoking and bladder cancer. And another reason is that they have noticed that there is an increase in duration and intensity of smoking. However, the risk levels off at higher intensity, but not at higher duration. So they wanted to look at both duration and intensity, and that's why they did this study on smoking and bladder cancer. So what is it that we're going to address today in terms of design issue? As I told you, we're going to look at the design issue and analysis issue. So the design issue are things that you have to keep in mind. If you want to design or contribute to design of a case control study with a researcher, or as you are reading case control study, you have to look into these specific elements. So these are elements that it's like a map for you. So you have to look at selection of cases, where they're coming from, how they are defined, selection of control, who are the control, where they are coming from, assessment of exposure, assessment of control and confounding, and identification of biases. And I'm going to go over each one of them. So selection of cases. So when I say a case of a disease, I have to be clear what constitutes a case. And to be clear what constitutes a case, I need to have definite criteria. So when I say bladder cancer, it has to be particularly, is it bladder cancer at stage 1 bladder cancer? When I talk about cardiovascular disease, I have to specify exactly the level, the intensity, etc. So my case definition should be very clear. So in order to have a group, cases that are homogeneous, you cannot have cases from everywhere. So you have to think about putting criteria, so you have to have strict diagnostic criteria for the cases. And you might think also about dividing your cases into like definite, probable, possible. And with these, you have to think also about what cases you would exclude. So it's like defining a population. So if you're doing a cross-section study, I mean, you're taking a population and you would like to do stuff on older adults. So you want to do prevalence of dementia in older adults. So who are your older adults? First, you have to specify the age. What is older adult? It's an age. Do you want to take older adults in houses, outside the houses, in institution, outside institution? And similarly with case control, the cases should be very well defined. So one is defined, so what cases are you taking? And second is how you're verifying that it's a case. And this is very important. So case verification comes from pathological report, from hospital admission or discharge records. You have to have a way, a mean, to either to ascertain that a case is a case. Otherwise, you don't know actually what you're looking at. Okay? So you need to do a case definition and a case verification. So, and this is from the book, from the article, which says the case series included, the case series of bladder cancer, included all patients with a histologically confirmed carcinoma of the urinary bladder including carcinoma in situ, newly diagnosed, specifying the time period when these were diagnosed in Maine and Vermont, and New Hampshire, among residents of 3 states aged 30 to 79. So it's histologically confirmed, specify the place, specify that it's newly diagnosed, and the age group. So they are, of course, excluding anyone who's less than 29, who's not resident, and of course they have a definition for what is a resident, so this person has been in this area for a certain period of time. Very important, and keep it in mind, newly diagnosed, because we're coming to it. Okay, so this is the case definition. And when we come to case verification, so they said that patient ascertainment was conducted through hospital pathology department, so they looked at the pathology report to make sure that this is the case they wanted, hospital cancer registries, and the state cancer registry, because they got all cases from different sources. But they made sure that all these were, you have case verification from all these sources. In addition to that, they also pre-tested each state's plan to locate patient and how they monitor and how these patients are audited. Moreover, so this is what they did, Kamena, to make sure that the cases are well diagnosed, quote unquote. So the study's expert pathologists carried out a blind review of the initial diagnostic slides to confirm diagnosis. And they picked up few slides from the pathology department, and from this, based on that, they found that 20 patients who didn't have cancer, 22 didn't have urothelial carcinoma, and these were excluded. So this is it's a very thorough case ascertainment. So you have to be very careful and very careful. So now, where do I get the cases? Because they come and seek care, usually most of the cases we get them from hospital. Okay, and we'll talk about why hospital and what is it good about a hospital. It could be hospital-based or medical care facility-based or population-based. Okay, so we can take all cases in the population. And how we do that? How would we take cases of bladder cancer in the population? Where can we get all the cases in Lebanon?
Ministry of Health, or they take the medications, for example, if you have the record of that.
So it could be, yes, this is, yes,
Cancer
exactly, this is
registry.
population. But again,
Cancer
this is good, because this is, you're talking about the population-based cases. But the issue is that when you decide that you want to have it, you have to have complete and reliable information. So are the information that you take from the Ministry of Health reliable? Is it complete? What do I mean by complete? Because ultimately you'd like to take these cases and you want to do a survey. You want to do an investigation, ask them whether they were exposed to smoking, so on and so forth. So would the Ministry of Health give you this information? We have a population, we have a registry. We have a registry in Lebanon for cancer. Unfortunately, it's not complete. Again, thinking about how complete is the registry, it's not complete. It's not complete because also we don't have good active reporting, good active reporting. So not all doctors send their result, their patient, etc. So you have to, that's why hospital-based is complete, reliable information, because you have the medical record, you have the pathology report, okay? And this is really the best base one you can get. However, it's not going to be a representative sample of all cases. However, you always have to think about internal validity in this case rather than external validity. And what do I mean by that? In case control study, it's not like I want to represent all cases. I want to have a good group of cases and compare them to an appropriate group of control. So it's about how well the results or how accurate my results are, but not to what extent my results apply to all cancer cases and in all Lebanon. So that when you have to compromise, you cannot compromise internal validity to generalize. So I take all the cases from the Ministry of Health. It's okay, they have incomplete information. No, you get cases from the hospital who have good definition of cases, good verification, because you don't want to compromise internal validity. You don't have cases that are not properly diagnosed or have missing information.
In this particular example, the cases can be ascertained because the pathology shows.
Of the pathology,
cancer.
exactly.
You can control it.
They have
factor.
three sources, yes, the pathology report. So if you do that, it's fine. Okay, but in Lebanon, you don't have this, and you cannot go to pathology department and tell them to get this information. So the most, and let's be pragmatic. How can we do it in Lebanon? So you're either in a hospital, and the hospital has a registry, and you have access to the registry, and you have all the information. But still, with this information, you need the consent of the doctor who's treating the patient to give you access to the patient. So what would be a better strategy is to go to ad hoc recruitment. Ad hoc recruitment is go to oncologists and ask oncologists to participate in your research. So therefore, you take their patient, so they would approach their patient that there is somebody interested in doing the research, and then you approach the patient to consent the cases to be part of your case control study. But definitely, when you have registries, as in the Scandinavian country registry, where you can get through it access to the cancer patient, that would be great. And in a Scandinavian country, you have registry for dementia, registry for all psychiatric disorder, registry for every single kind of cancer. This is a population base. So if we want to think about hospital versus population base, the best population base should be a registry. And every oncologist, every pathology department should report to a national registry. We don't have a good national registry yet, but we can get data from it. So prevalent versus incidence. So one is hospital versus population base. Second is what type of cases. You have prevalent cases and incident cases. Prevalent cases are when you go and ask you, do you have cancer? So you go to a population base, you do a survey and you say, do you have cancer? This person has cancer, have been diagnosed with cancer. And these people have been a while living with cancer. This is prevalent. Incident cases are newly diagnosed cases. This is when we do follow-up of people, follow-up of participants, and you're able to do that. Or if you go to a hospital, you say that I want to have only people who have been newly diagnosed with cancer in the past 1 or 2 years. Now, this way, people don't change that habit in the past, in the first or second year. So you want newly recent diagnosed cases. So to the extent possible, in a case control, and this is an important message, avoid prevalent cases. Why to avoid prevalent cases? Of course, when people record, one of the most important issues in case control is that people have to record their exposure. Okay, and if you're thinking about exposure that occurred long time ago, this is an issue. Another issue is that people living with a certain disease might have changed their habit because of the disease. So if you collect information about exposure, this does not actually reflect the exposure before the occurrence of lung cancer or the diagnosis of lung cancer, but this behavior occurred actually because of the diagnosis and not before the diagnosis. So therefore, it's very important, and there is an interesting note that says that in prevalent cases, we usually represent cases of long duration. If the outcome has a high case fatality rate and people don't live too long, you will be left with those people, the survivors, okay, and the people who have been living for a long time, and that's why I'm saying people change their behavior because of living with a particular disease. So why prevalent again versus incidence cases? Because sometimes even the determinant of the disease duration may be related to the exposure. So if you're smoking, if you're a light smoking, you might be living more with the disease. So you would be more likely to find prevalent cases because they have a low level of smoking. And those who had high level of smoking already have developed quickly and are the most severe, and you're not able to capture them. Second is to actually, as we said, the accurately record antecedent event, especially when people have been living a long period of time. And with prevalent cases, it's more difficult to assess temporality. So these are the things that I'm talking about. So what came first? The diagnosis or the exposure, and the ability to record really past event. So again, this is for the case definition. as an illustration from the article, the case series included all patients with a histologically confirmed carcinoma, again, newly diagnosed, sorry, this is a repetition. So I just put it for you to see the newly diagnosed. So the newly diagnosed in the past 3 years, okay? So we said what? Selection of, so first is case ascertainment, case verification and selection, and incident versus prevalence. These are the two most important things about cases, and of course, where do I get? So sources, incidence, prevalence, and what do we say other than incident, prevalence, and the ascertainment, okay, definition and ascertainment. So now the control. So control, أهم شيء إنه conceptually they should come from the same source population as cases. Okay, so if I'm taking control from population of Beirut, okay, the cases, excuse me, so therefore the control should come from an urban environment or the city of Beirut. So where the cases have occurred, so would have been cases is diagnosed with the disease coming, مش بس هيك, so from the same source population, sorry. So it's not only where they're coming from, but also from the same source population. So the prevalence of exposure coming among the control should reflect the prevalence of exposure in the source population. I'm taking people who are diseased and people who are non-diseased. These non-diseased should represent people, the healthy, who are not diagnosed, who did not actually, who at the time of the survey don't have the bladder cancer or any type of cancer. So therefore, these should represent any type of exposure, should be the exposure of the population. Let me give you an example. If I'm doing the bladder cancer and smoking at AUB, and I pick up cases from AUB, okay? And I'm interested in looking at the smoking, the prevalence of smoking. So I pick up controls. These controls should have the prevalence of exposure similar to what I know as the prevalence of smoking. We know from the literature that smoking, the prevalence of smoking among males is around 45%. So if I get my control and I found that the prevalence of smoking is 20% among male or 60%, this is not a good group. This means that you are selecting a group that does not actually come from the general population. It's a very selective group that's either not exposed for some reason, maybe they are nuns, or they are overexposed. And this is not the control that we want. We want a control that's a control that does not have, that's similar to the general population or the healthy population where the cases are coming from. However, there are issues when we select a control. The conceptual issue is that should they be very comparable to the cases except the disease? So they should come from the same environment, the same SES, etc. One. And should they be representative of all non-diseased people in the population? And this is what I'm saying. Okay? So should they come from really the healthy? And to what extent they should be comparable? They should be alike with respect to variables such as socio-demographic, social environment, etc. But practically, can we do it? So you have to think that if I want my controls to be very, very comparable, can I do it? Is the approach feasible? And if the approach feasible, do I have the funds to do it? So you have always to think about your resources. And of course, you have always to do a compromise. There's always a compromise. Don't compromise validity, but sometimes you're limited by what you have in terms of human resources or money. So we can select them as population-based control. So if I want to the healthy, these are usually population-based, so they come from the general population. So where are we getting the cases? Most of the time from hospital, okay, or from cancer registry. And where do we want to get the control? From a defined area. So we take all the cases from AUBMC, and I'd like to take controls from the population, which is the catchment area of AUBMC. And AUBMC is not the best example. Why?
It's not accessible to all.
It's referral center.
It's a referral center.
كمان you don't see all cases done. It's not accessible.
I'm not controls. Okay. So I have cases. So I identify cases from AUBMC. I have 100 cases, 1,000 cases over the past 2 years on bladder cancer. I want to pick up controls. So I want to get them from the catchment area of AUBMC or from the population of AUBMC who come to AUBMC.
Socioeconomic status of this population.
Okay. Okay, from the general population. I would disagree because you have all classes. And you have the first, second, and third class, and you have the Ministry of Health beds. But the issue is that it captures a wide range of, a wide variety of people that would come from different areas of Lebanon. So is it feasible to go and capture all these areas? It's not actually Beirut. The catchment area of AUBMC is much broader. I think from south, north, west, east, all the way maybe to the Bekaa. So the issue is that the catchment area is pretty difficult. So to do a neighborhood walk and go door to door to have control for AUBMC would be difficult. I can do some kind of a telephone recruitment. How can I do a telephone recruitment? I can do a random digit dialing. So I can produce a whole list of telephones from all over Lebanon and then call people and say, are you somebody who's between age 30, let's say, to 64? Yes. Have you ever been diagnosed with bladder cancer? No. Okay, this is a potential control. So with respect to the age, group, and what? That they don't have the disease. So this could be a control. You could take from different areas proportionally to size by just doing random digit dialing, or maybe go to this area, which I think is not very feasible. So what would be another option? Is to take family. Okay, so what you do is you take a family control. So family control could be siblings, spouses, relatives, and you can take friends and co-workers as controls. So again, what you can do is for every case you can say, would you please identify the people who live with you or the immediate family, let's say, and you have a listing, and then you see who are eligible in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria, specifically with respect to age, for example, and gender maybe, and then take a random sample, and as long as these people don't have any diagnosis of cancer. Okay, so this is another. The issue is that these controls could be very, very similar to your cases, to the extent that sometimes you can't find a relationship, not because there's no relationship, but they have so many commonality or common risk factor and the common environment, to the extent that the relationship with your main exposure is diluted. Okay? Another one, so they don't represent what the broader population, but they represent very much the cases, and where the cases, it's a very close environment. The other place is a hospital base, and this is something that's very commonly done in case control studies. We take inpatient with other diseases, outpatient or visitor. Hospital base are really good sources of control, and let me tell you why. Why? Let me hear from you. Why they could be good sources?
They represent the population.
They could be from the same, of course, and the catchment area, if you're taking them from the hospital, so again, so you capture at least the geographic location of these two. So at least, and if you want to control for environmental thing or socioeconomic, you'll be able to do that. Second, when they are in the hospital, especially inpatient, verification, so you'll be able to verify the non-disease, the non-lung, the non-cancer status. You'll have access to the same type, in hospital, and I missed to say that whenever you take hospital-based cases, also it's good because you have access to the records. So you have good records, it's more cooperative, and the people coming in the hospital are more cooperative, you have good records. And here also, when you have controls from the hospital, you have access to the record, you have the same, you could use the same case control as certainly. Okay? And usually when they are in the hospital, again, they are more approachable, it's easier to work with these people, so on and so forth. outpatient, so inpatient, outpatient, and visitor. So I want to particularly talk about the inpatient with other diseases. So what kind of other diseases do we take? Any kinds of diseases? Okay, so we're talking about lung cancer. I want to pick up particular lung cancer. So can I take COPD? And why yes and why no? COPD, people coming for upper respiratory infections, people coming for...
exposed to tobacco, smoking.
What do you mean?
Therefore,
Okay, so what is it about COPD? Do you know about COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease? One of its risk factors is what?
Smoking.
Smoking.
It's the same as
So what do you expect as the prevalence of smoking among COPD? To be high. So is the prevalence of smoking representative of the general population? No. So when you compare them to the lung cancer, okay, again, the association will be diluted, not because smoking is not related, but because of your poor selection of controls. And this is something we call a selection bias. So this is not a proper control. What would be a good control with other diseases? You can take surgery patients, outpatient. Surgical patients are the best usually. Orthopedic, people coming for hip fracture, etc. These would be best. So you can take, so therefore, inpatient with other diseases, so be careful when you pick up these other diseases, outpatient or visitors. The visitor control are similar to the population base, it's very much a population base, and they are approachable. So when they come in, you assume that they're coming from the same population that gave us the cases, the source population. Okay, so visitor control. And you see now papers and EPI where people compare, they take two groups of control. They take hospital, they take inpatient or other diseases, and they take visitor, and they try to compare. Always when you take other diseases, usually the estimate is a little bit diluted because these are patients and they are have a lot of morbidity, and they are the severe cases who come to the hospital exposed to so many risk factors. However, it could be a good control group. Okay?
can we do
So, yes,
do
okay. Yes, go on.
can we select for each case a control?
Yes, we're coming to it. Yes, we're coming to it. So we're starting بس عم نحكي إنه compare، بس ما عم نحكي comparable، عم نحكي إنه where we'll get them. So hospital-based, or it's like the cases. We said, where do we get the cases? Population-based is registry or ad hoc recruitment, or hospital-based from pathology department. Similarly for the control. And here we're talking about hospital-based control, most appropriate for hospital-based with ill-defined catchment area. And I'm ill-defined, this is broadly defined. It's too much for us, AUB, to go to a very broad defined area. Second is often chosen from diagnostic, not thought to be related to the exposure. This is something that I discussed, did you get me? So pick up another disease group we know is not related to smoking, if we're doing the smoking. And then assumption, we always have to make assumption that those people who come for other diagnoses, also they come from the same catchment area for cases, and control reflect exposure distribution of source population. These are assumptions. Do you think we can verify this assumption? You can verify this assumption. And what you're saying is that these surgical patients, they have the exposure similar to the general population, but you can verify. And when you collect the data, you'll be able to verify that the prevalence of smoking is at least similar to the general population. You make the assumption at first, but when you collect the data, you can always say that the assumption is right or wrong. Okay, and similarly to the catchment area for the control diagnosis, you can always ask where they're coming from, and then make sure that they're coming, at least look at the distribution by residents. So simple or multiple, this answers your question. So one, should I take one or more than one control? So I have 100 cases. Usually I'm limited with the number of cases. I'm always limited. It's a rare disease. So therefore I don't have like an infinite number of cases. I have newly diagnosed, so I have maybe 200, maybe 1,000. So should I take another 1,000 or should I take more? Should I take one type of control or more? Should I take my control to be very comparable or not? And this is what we call match. So we have three issues here. One, multiple control of similar type. So let's say I have 100 cases, I want to take controls from the hospital, okay, from the visitor. So should I take 100 or 200? Now, the larger the sample size in general, the more power for the study. And what do I mean power? It's the ability to your study to detect differences or association if an association exists. Okay, so if you have an association, the power is about how good, how powerful, how large the sample size is to allow you to detect differences if differences exist. So now if you have, sometimes you have a very small number of cases, 20. So would another 20 be powerful? You will not be able to detect significant differences, not because we don't have a relationship, but it's very small to detect any difference. So what you do is that you increase the number of, can you increase the number of cases? No, you increase the number of controls. So instead of taking one to one, so 100, 100 or 20, 20, I would take 20, 2 controls, 3 controls, 4 controls. But we know that beyond 4 control per case, you don't gain any improvement in power. So if you have 100, you take 400. The 500, it's a loss of resources, and you're not actually improving the power. So you don't, and this is ethical, because sample size is an ethical issue. So you don't want to take 500 when actually the 400 is good enough for you and gives you the same power. Okay? So again, multiple control of the same type. So I'm taking control from what I mean by the same type. Let's say I decide only visitor, I decide only other diseases. So should I take multiple? Yes, especially if your cases are small. You want to increase the sample size. You do your sample size calculation, but again, you can take up to 4 per case. So 4 controls per case. Now, different types of control, yes. If you have the means and if you have the resources, you can take hospital control, compare them to neighborhood control. So you would be comparing your cases. You don't take a pool of controls from different sources, put them together. No, you'll have the cases, control 1, control 2. So you have 2 groups of control, and you make your comparison case with control 1, case with control 2, and you see how the estimates are changing. Okay, and you can always reflect. Most of the studies, we find actually very similar relationship, but sometimes it's underestimated in hospital. Sometimes you get the same, especially if our hospital control are a good representation of the general population. Okay. Third, matched or unmatched. So match is unmatched is do I want to take, if I pick up a male who's age 40, do I want a male who is age 40 who has bladder cancer? So should my control be male, age 40, not having bladder cancer? So I match with respect to specifically, let's say, socio-demographic variable. Or I want unmatched. So I pick up all the cases and then I pick up a group of control. And what's the issue here and how to decide on what to do? First, let me go back to the article and see how they selected their control. So control, it's a very interesting, well-done article. So control subject age 30 to 64 were selected randomly from Department of Motor Vehicle DMV record in each state, and control subject age 65 to 79 were selected from beneficiary records of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So almost, let me not say 100%, but I can say that overwhelming majority of older adult people in the US have a driver's license. And when you go to even buy stuff in supermarket, you don't show your ID, you show your driver's license. It's like your ID, the ID that we carry. So for these adults, we have driver's license. After 64, people lose their driver's license. And then from the Medicare and Medicaid services, Medicare is an organization that provides medical services to the older adult. They pick up a random sample, so they have listing. And this is very interesting. What they did, if you would like to go back, they even looked at people who have, those who don't have driver's license, compare them to those who have driver's license to see even having a driver's license has anything to do with the selection of the controls. And they found that there are no differences. And Hatta thinking about whether this is a good source. So the control subject now, so we know the source, the control subject were frequently, so is it the population based or is it hospital based? What kind of source for control? What type of control? It's a population based, it's a purely population based control. So the control subject, however, were frequency matched to case patient by state, sex, within 5 years of age and diagnosis of patient. So what is it that we hear here, what we read? Frequency match. And we said matched. Match, yani it's matched. Every person has a matched control. But what is frequency match? So we have two types of matching. We have individual matching. So for every case that we identify, okay, as you are collecting your cases, okay, you go and find the control. Okay, you go and find the control, which is a unique control for that case. It could be one or two. It doesn't have to be one match. It could be 1, 2. Yani your repair is 1, 2. So, and this means that you have to unique control that's matched with the case on confounders. I don't know if you are familiar with the issue of confounder. These are noise. These are variables that might create noise that you'd like to control for. For example, you don't want to pick up. You don't want to have, like, say, a group of cases who are adult and then pick up those who are younger people, for example, or older adult people. You don't want your cases to be, let's say, a majority of male, while your controls are a mixture of male and female. So there are some confounder, the confounder are age, gender, etc. So you pick up few characteristics that you know might affect the result, and you control for, again, it's like what they did in the article. So they controlled for age, gender, and what? What did they control for? Sorry, let me go back. So state, gender, and age and diagnosis of patient. Okay? No. So this is individual matching. And this is very important to be able to identify or to decide what to do, because this also have repercussion on the analysis. So if you're talking about individual matching, this means that you are thinking about your study as pairs of people. So the people is a pair. And the analysis, you're not doing analysis on people, you are doing an analysis on a couple. One of them is diseased, one of them is not diseased. So if you have 100 matched people, individually matched to another 100, we're not talking about 200, we're talking about 100 pairs. And this has also, you have to think about the power of it. So it's not, doesn't have a power as much as a study where you have unmatched 100. So you're doing your study on, your analysis on 100 pairs. The group matching, on the other side, is you select the controls in such a way that their distribution with respect to a particular confounder is similar to the distribution or that of that confounder in the cases. What do I mean? If I collect all the cases, I find that the cases and the control are 50-50. So I select my controls, not 1-to-1, but I select the control so that 50% of them are male, 50% of them are female. So this is what we call frequency match. Another example, if I have to collect first the data on the cases, and the frequency match, the disadvantage compared to the individual matching. The individual matching, as you identify a case, you go and find the control. Okay? In the group matching, you have to first collect the data on all your cases, see their distribution with respect to the characteristic you want to control for, be it age, gender, residence, place of residence. See where they are, how many are in Maine, how many are in Vermont, how many are in the age group 30 to 45, 46 to 55, 55, etc. So what's the proportion? And then, when you select your controls, you have to keep in mind this distribution. So you won't have two differently distributed groups with respect to these main variables. So again, we don't want the cases to be more of elderly and with a group of control that are more young people. Okay, so you want at least to have similar distribution. So this, we call them group matching or frequency matching. Now, in the frequency matching, we don't lose the sample size. What I mean is that if we have 100 cases and 100 frequency match control, the analysis is done on 200. The individual match, if I have 100 individuals who are matched, 100 cases matched with 100 controls, I'm working with a couple, 100 pairs. You get me? So the frequency match, the analysis is like unmatched. It's an unmatched analysis. So I don't look at the pairs, I look at the individual, different individual, the cases and the control as individual, not as pairs. Okay? Now, a problem with individual matching, the issue with individual matching is that also we have issues like group matching, is you have to sometimes look at different individual in order to find the proper match. And come in, sometimes it's not always evident that I will be able to find a perfect match for my case. Okay, so this is matching on gender. This is an example. I have 10 cases, 10 controls. Don't look at the E and the N. Don't let them confuse you. I have males. These are 20. I have 10 males and 10 females. Yes, select case number. Okay, I have 75% in the case, not in the case. In the case, 70%, 75% are male and 25% are female. So when I select my controls, I select my controls so that the percent of females is around 25. If I do individual matching, such as here, so for a male, I find a male. For another male, I go and find a male. Okay, and then I look whether both of them are exposed, one of them is exposed, another one is not exposed. Let me tell you how it happens. So I take a case, the case is a male, let's say an older adult male, so greater than 64, I will pick up and the person is a case, and then I ask him or I ask her, do you smoke? Yes, the person smokes. Okay? I go and find the control, who's a male, who's again an older adult, greater than 64, and I can ask this person, do you smoke? This person might be, and this person is not diseased, this person might be also a smoker. So I might have a pair where both the case and its pair are both exposed. I could choose a pair where one of the element is exposed and the other is not exposed. So the case could be exposed and the control would not be exposed. So on and so forth. So if you take the first one, this is a couple, this is a pair where I have both exposed, male exposed. Here I have exposed, non-exposed. They could both of them be non-exposed, or the control could be exposed while the case is not exposed. And when you do case control study and you're looking for the risk factor, what is it that you're looking for? You'd like to see more of the pairs where what? Your case is exposed or your control is exposed? Your case, and a risk factor. So you'd like to see these kind of pairs where your case is exposed while your control is not exposed, and not vice versa. So this is actually what you want to look for, and this is actually what you want to identify. And we'll see how we do the analysis later on. So we talked about what? Cases, controls, issues of selection, issues of the type, the number, etc. Now we want to collect information. It's very important. Okay, and this is actually a map, and think about it as a map. I have the population, and then I decide on the criteria, how to select them, what are inclusion, exclusion criteria, where to get them, how to compare them, how to match them, etc. Now, what kind of data I want to collect? I want to collect data that is accurate data. And accurate data means it has to be valid and reliable data. So again, even if you have the best cases and controls, but if your questionnaire, if your data are not accurate, again, you don't have. So this is part of your internal validity, is about the assessment. So where you take usually your data on the exposure, you can take it from the self-report. And if we think about smoking, where do we get information about smoking? Do you think the medical records have information about smoking? They might have. But how accurate and how consistent, how valid, okay, what kind of assessment we take. So when we have a person who comes and then diagnosed with lung cancer, so what kind of question? Are you a smoker? Do you smoke? Have you ever smoked? What kind of question do you think? Are you a smoker? I don't think you have like a detailed history of smoking. You don't have something about smoking pattern. So the question is very raw, and you will not be able to collect information, not to mention that you don't have a consistent definition of smoking, you don't know who's collecting the data, you don't know who's recording the data, so this is not a place where you can, the record is not a good document where you can collect this kind of an exposure. But also I have to worry about the self-reporting because, again, the issue in particularly case control study is the recall bias. And the recall bias is something where your cases would be more likely to remember the exposure, past exposure, than control because of their disease. Okay. That's why one of the ways to overcome this is when you take people who are diseased from the hospital. So the recall period usually, the recall bias usually is a little bit diluted, because also anybody who's diseased usually remembers all these events. They are more sensitive to their exposure, they remember better. So if you take them from the hospital, so at least you can little bit dilute this recall bias. But if you take them from the general population, you have to at least keep in mind the recall bias. How to overcome, again, if you take rigorous data, very rigorous data and detailed history of smoking from both your cases and control, this would be a way to overcome this issue of recall bias. So if you both, you give the same cues, you give the same cues, and you have very detailed history, you might be able to account for this. If you have good questions, this is another way to do it. And you can get the information from the records, depends on the exposure that you are looking at. And sometimes if you're not able to take information from the person himself or herself, we take interview with surrogate. It means we take information from spouses, siblings, etc. So how did they do it in the study? So individuals who agreed to participate were interviewed at home by a trained interviewer using a detailed computer-assisted personal interview. So it's not only about the questions, whether they are good questions, it's about training your interviewer. Because training your interviewer or whoever is collecting the data enhances reliability of the question. So if you don't interview and actually I had a recent incident on that. Some of the interviewer, when we started looking at the data, we found that there is actually an inflated prevalence of a certain diseases. When we look carefully at by interviewer, we found that 2 interviewers had particularly an inflated prevalence compared to the others. So when we went with them again in the field, these were trained, but we went with them in the field. So we found out that particularly they were asking 2 particular questions very quickly. This is about dementia. So they thought that if they ask it quickly and they don't remind the older adult, this means they will be able to capture dementia. However, this was not the instruction they had. The instruction they had is to say it slowly and repeat it so the adult can actually keep it in mind, remember, and then after a few minutes they will ask again the dementia. So this is an issue of lack of reliability because of the interviewer. So you have to keep in mind that trained interviewers are very important. A good questionnaire is very important. And the way you put the way you conceptualize and the way you put the indicator is very important. And this is here, what they did is they took detailed information on demographics, use of tobacco products, occupational, residential history, fluid intake, and all this information. They had very detailed history on smoking. So you have to have several indicators of a concept, actually make your indicator more reliable. And of course, you have to think also about validity. So how valid is your indicator? Whenever you're doing a study, don't be shy. Go and take from others. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but use data and use the measurements that are already available and over there. So how far back should the exposure be assessed? this is the, you have to define an empirical induction period, so you have to go back, let's say, I don't know, depends on the, on when the, let's say, smoking start making changes to the, give me the, help me here, the empirical induction. And when you start seeing changes in the body, so you cannot like ask exposure for the past 2 years. You need to ask exposure in the past, let's say 10 years or 20 years. Second is when you code your exposure data, you have to code it in an etiologically relevant manner. It means that it's not enough to ask whether people are exposed or not. It should also, and these are the indicators that I was talking about, you have to inquire about the magnitude of exposure, years of exposure, and whether people are ever exposed. Very important when we're talking about smoking, we said tobacco products. So that's why now when you have a questionnaire on smoking, you have to include both water pipe smoking and cigarette. It's not enough anymore to say, have you ever smoked? Have you ever smoked cigarette? Yes, no. Are you currently smoking cigarette? Yes, no. How long have you been smoking? Have you ever smoked water pipe? How long have you been smoking? When did you start? How many rounds per day, etc. And that's why when we used to, years ago, to collect data on smoking and to say, well, this person is not smoker, however, he did get cancer or something, this person was a smoker. He could have been one water pipe smoker, he could have been exposed to environmental tobacco smoking from other people smoking in the house. Okay? And this is some passive smoking. Okay? Now we're more aware of that. So, and that, again, in the article, they defined never smoker as subject who had smoked less than 100 cigarettes over their lifetime. Not only never at all have even a puff. Occasional smoker who has smoked more than 100. So this is what you actually have to specify. You have to be that specific when you talk about assessment of exposure or assessment of any kind of value. So it has to be very specific. Here they're saying that everybody, anyone who smoked more than 100 but never consumed cigarette regularly, at least, what is regularly? It's at least 1 cigarette per day for at least 6 months. This is occasional. And the regular smoking is somebody who consumed more than occasional, and they had at least 1 cigarette per day for the last 6 months. Okay? Again, the ascertainment of exposure, again, following that, among never smoker, they assessed exposure to environmental tobacco smoke. We don't say anymore passive smoking, we say exposure to tobacco product or environmental tobacco smoke. Again, also they asked about the number of people, so it's a measure. So how many people were smoking in the house where you lived, for at least 2 years, since the age of 10, and at the longest job they held for at least 6 months since the age of 16 years. So very specific to capture exposure of these cases and control with respect to environmental tobacco smoke, because the objective of that study was twofold. One is to look at duration and intensity, and they wanted to see the relation between environmental tobacco smoke and bladder cancer. So this is with respect to measurement. So we said that when we look at a case control study, we have to make sure that we are not at least doing any biases, and we have to make sure that our study is free of bias, one. So this is how you start building your study. And if you're evaluating other people's work, case control study, you also have to look at these particular biases. Because when you want to evaluate any type of association, so you have, let's say, an association, a relative risk. Do you all are familiar with relative risk odds ratio? Anyone is not familiar? So it's a measure of effect, okay? So how more likely is a case to be exposed than a control, for example? So whenever you have, any time you have an odds ratio, any type of an effect measure, you have to ask yourself, is it actually a true measure? So you have to start thinking about chance. This is not on the slide. So you have to think, is that due to chance? So in order to decide this, you have to see whether the p-value is less than 0.05 or not. Mascool? But the p-value is not good enough. You always have to look at the 95% confidence interval, okay? To see, maybe because if you're, yes, Even if it's the one is inside, if you have a very broad confidence interval, even if the one is not inside or inside, if you have a small sample size, you have a very large confidence interval. So one is you have to think about, is it due to chance or it's a true value? So this is one. Second, you say, is it due to a confounding effect? So is it due because of because I did not control for other variables. So a person is not because he's a smoker, because smoking is related to physical activity is related to cancer. So it's not because he's a smoker, but because he is physically inactive, for example. So did you control for this? 3 is the study free of biases? So it is controlled for, okay, you have, so you know that it's the odds ratio of 2 is great. It's not due to confounding, adjusted odds ratio is still 2, but is the 2 because of the way I selected my cases and control? Is it the way because of the way of I collected the data or because of a certain problem in my measure? So I have to think about, okay, the selection bias, excuse me for that. So the selection bias is, for example, did the control represent the population from which the cases arose? So as I said, if you're picking up your controls from only the diseased, and it's not a proper, it's not a proper group of controls. So it's not actually representing where the cases are coming from. Okay, so this is a selection bias. So if I have an underestimate of my OR, I have a bias. Why the bias? Because it's the way I selected my control. So it's a bias in selection of the control. It could be as well a bias in selecting a case. So maybe the case have been a case diagnosed as a case because of the exposure. So people are, these are, we call them, what we call them? Those who are under medical surveillance bias or detection bias. These are examples of selection bias. So people who are taking oral contraceptive, for example, are always, could be always under surveillance, medical surveillance, because they are taking oral contraceptive. So when they have a particular disease, it's not because of the sorry, okay. So OC are more. So it's not because of the OC, but because they are being very well followed up because of the OC. So if you know, let's say, let me give you a better example. If I give a radiologist an X-ray for the lung, and I tell this radiologist that this person is a smoker, so the radiologist would really look very thoroughly, very carefully to find some kind of a lesion in the lung. While if I selected my case, and if I selected these cases of lung cancer without the knowledge of the radiologist that this person is a smoker, this means that selection is not done dependent of the exposure. So if the selection is done based on the exposure, okay, this means that this is not a good case. Okay, so this is selection bias. So therefore, I will have an inflation of the OR because I expect that these people will be very much observed to the extent that I will be able to diagnose this disease at a higher level because they are they are exposed. And the controls, a poor choice of a control could produce a selection bias that could alter or affect my estimate. So my estimate, it could be towards the null, يعني مبطل في relationship, or it could be an under or over estimate of the relationship, in either way. Okay? Other types of biases are information bias, so it's biases while collecting the data. So we're talking about selection, and then we're talking about the way we collect the data. There is differential bias in case control, and we just talked about it, which is the recall bias. What does it mean? It means that the cases will be more likely to recall the exposure, and that's why this OR that I found of 2 or 3, it's not because they are more exposed, but it's because they are more likely to recall the exposure. So how to control for this? You always have to think about it and to keep it in mind and to make sure at least that whatever design that you're using, whatever tools that you are using, at least again, this could at least help you in addressing this issue. Again, the type of control, taking control from the hospital again can solve this problem. Other type of measurement biases If the exposure, the outcome of interest is not clearly defined, this could produce a measurement bias. If the measurements are not objective, so you have to make sure that you have good measures, that the people are, as much as possible, the people who collect the data are blinded, because if they know the person is non-cancer, they might probe more. Just probing more to get the information, because they know that this person has lung cancer, and this person, smoking is one of the risk factors that we are looking for. So observer and interviewers regularly trained and well-written protocol, standardized procedure, these are all could affect or could improve or could enhance the validity and the accuracy of your measurement. And if they are not enhanced, they can produce measurement bias that could affect ultimately your result. Okay? So, how to measure? Okay, am I on time? So until 7, okay. So how to measure now? So how to analyze data that come from a case control study? It's a table, regular 2x2 table. So I have case control, and exposed, non-exposed. Okay, usually I have, the cases are fixed, yes? Especially when we take them from hospitals. So it's not a registry, it's not a population base. So I know that I have 100 cases, which are the A and the C. And then I choose the control, which are B and D. So you have to think about these totals as fixed totals. And what vary is the exposure. So I take the cases, I take the controls, and then within the case, I classify them into whether they are exposed or not exposed based on my investigation for the cases and the controls. Okay? Good? So what is it that I measure in case control? I cannot measure a probability of disease, okay? Because it's fixed. And if I take 100 cases and 100 controls, it's not 50% who have the disease. So I cannot measure prevalence or incidence of diseases. I can measure odds of the disease. And odds of the disease is odds of exposure, or odds of exposure or odds of disease, okay? Odds of exposure or odds of the disease or being a case. So in that example, I have a case. So what's the odds of exposure in the case? So it's A over C. Okay, and what's my odds of exposure in the control? It's B over D. So the ratio of the odds is my odds ratio, which gives me a measure of effect. So how much is the case, okay, has a higher odds or a different odds, or what's the odds of the case of exposure compared to that of the control? So, okay, so let me rephrase. So I was a bit blah blah blah. So what is the odds of exposure of the case, okay, versus controls? Okay. So I have A over C, B over D, and which turns out to be AD over BC. Now, if I say what's the odds of being a case among the exposed, can I do that? Yes. So it's A over B. And what's the odds of exposure among the control? What's the odds of being a case among those not exposed? So what's the odds of being a case among the exposed? What's the odds of being a case among the non-exposed? Is C over D. So A over B over C over D would give you the same OR of AD over BC. So the odds of exposure is the same as the odds of disease in a case control study. Okay? Am I making myself clear? Okay. So how do I interpret the odds? So if my odds ratio is equal to 1, this means that the odds of exposure in the cases is the same as the odds of exposure in the control. It means that I have no association between disease and exposure. If it's more than 1, this means my exposure is a risk factor, so the odds of exposure is higher in the case, always the case as in my numerator. And if it's less than 1, this means that the whatever factor I'm measuring or investigation is a protective factor, so therefore the odds of exposure in the case is less than the odds of exposure in the controls. Okay, so OR is the measure of choice for the association in case control study. So I said that the analysis is actually different when we have a match versus unmatched. So an unmatched study, okay, we have the OR, which is AD over BC. We'll do a quick example. So it's AD over BC. This is for the crude OR. So the crude OR is only when you take only you consider the exposure with your disease. When you control for other factor, and this is what we call an adjusted OR, we do something called unconditional logistic regression. The logistic regression is missing. So when you do multivariate analysis, which means that you consider your exposure with other variables which could be confounded, you do something called multivariate analysis, and you do the multivariate is unconditional logistic regression. If you're doing matched analysis, your OR is not the AD over BC. Your OR is simply a B over C. And it's the multivariate analysis, you should read conditional, you should use or read in the article conditional logistic regression. Conditional because I have individual matching. So for individual matching, conditional logistic regression. Let me go to the Mabat. There's a little bit of... So this is, I want to go directly to the pair. So this is the way we set up the pairs. So I have n pairs, and I have four outcomes. Okay, 4 types of pairs. If you remember, we had 4 types of pairs. A pair where both your case and control are exposed. Is it clear how the table is set up? It's not a case control. It's not like case control status and the column and case control status and the row and the exposure as a row, the row variable. So you have exposed, non-exposed a case, exposed, non-exposed a control. So the A is a concordant pair where both of them are exposed. A D is a concordant pair where both of them are not exposed. And these are the ones that I'm not interested in. So these are not the pairs that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in particularly, and we talked about it, I introduced it a little bit, is a pair where your case is exposed and the control is not exposed, of course, and of course you want to compare it to the pair where the control is exposed but the case is not exposed. And we call them discordant pair. Okay, discordant pair. So in matched case control analysis, I don't use all the cells, I only use the discordant pair, and the OR is that ratio of the discordant pair. Yes? Okay, so let's take an example. Analysis of matched case control study. So this is an epidemiologist that was interested in looking at antibiotic therapy during infancy and related to the development of asthma in later childhood. So he started with the cases with the newly diagnosed childhood asthma from 5 medical facilities serving a large city in North Carolina. So again, they started with the asthma. 500 controls were also selected from outpatients with diagnoses unrelated to asthma, visiting the same facility during the same time period as the cases. The cases and controls were pair matched on age, sex, and parental smoking status. And their exposure is antibiotic therapy in infancy and to see whether this is a risk factor for asthma. Okay, so they controlled for the, by taking matching age, gender, and parental smoking, this means that you already controlled for it. So the people are very similar, the pairs are similar. So these are the way that we put the data. So I have 500 pairs, okay? So let's take the concordant, 170 are concordant pairs. So it means both those with asthma and no asthma are both exposed to antibiotic therapy during infancy. The 105 is another concordant pair where both the asthmatic and non-asthma children have not been exposed to antibiotic in infancy. And then the discordant pair are the 145 and the 80. Okay? So you have the 145 where your control is not exposed while your case is exposed, and the 80 where your control is exposed while your case is not exposed. So the OR is simply B over C, so 145 over 80 is 1.8. So the odds of exposure among asthmatic is 1.8 times that of controls. It's not at risk, it's not a risk, it's not more likely to develop asthma. It's the odds of exposure among those with asthma is 1.8 times that among true controls. Okay? Did you get me? So, is it significant? So 1.8. If we look at the 95% confidence interval is 1.38 to 2.38. So in a confidence interval, if it does include the value of the null, and what is the value of the null? The null, it means when there is no relationship. When there is no relationship, it's 1. So since it does not include the 1, this means that this is a significant OR. Okay? Good? Okay, let me go back a little bit, but I think I have few more minutes. So if I just, I don't know if this is, can you see, or, I think it's a bit difficult to see. Let me just skip this and go back to this one. Sorry. I had one on, okay, so can you see it? Because you can't see it. Okay, so let's take the, this is the odds ratio and 95% confidence interval of bladder cancer according to duration smoked and number of cigarettes smoked per day among smokers only. Okay, so they took the smokers only. So let's take the first, so the first column is smoking duration from less than 20 years to greater than 50 years, and we have the old subject. And then the remaining columns are for the smoking intensity, less than 1 pack per day, 1 to 2 packs, 2 and more packs per day. And again, we have also for all subjects. So we have for all subjects, irrespective of their smoking duration, and we have for all subjects, irrespective of their smoking intensity. So if we look here, okay, so let me take this slide, okay? Whenever you see 1, this means this is the reference category, okay? So this means that I'm comparing this to less than 1 pack, this one to less than 1 pack, okay? So I would take the 1 to 2 pack. So for those people who smoke for 1 to 2 packs per day, the odds of bladder cancer, well, odds of the disease, okay, it's much easier for you, okay? So the odds of bladder cancer is 1.2 that of those who smoke less than 1 pack per day. Okay? Is it significant? The confidence interval is from 0.9 to 1.5. So I move also to the 2 and more pack per day. Again, if we look at the second category of smoking intensity, it's 1.1, it's not significant. Okay? Now, if we look at the smoking duration, and I look here, okay, so this is the total for all smoking duration. 1 is for the category, which is the reference, which is less than 20. So I want to compare all the smoking duration compared to the less than 20 years. Okay, so it's my reference category. It's as if I'm saying that this is the unexposed, and the remaining one are the exposed category. So if we take the category of exposure, where the duration is between 20 and 29 years, the OR is 1.5, which means that 50% higher odds of having lung cancer, okay, of being a case, compared to those who are less than 20 years, who have been smoking for less than, is it significant? Yes, it's 1.1 to 1.9. And you see that as we go down, the OR increase, okay, and they are all significant. So what's important here is the smoking duration rather than the intensity. And if you see even within each category of pack, the intensity, you see that there is a gradient. Yani as people smoke for longer period of time, again that OR increases, and this is obvious in everyone. So 0.9, 1.7, 2, 2.7, 1.4, 2.7, etc. And it increases. And if we take all of them, it is clear that smoking duration is a particular risk factor. So this is actually the analysis that you need to read or produce yourself. So you can look at categories of exposure or total exposure. Okay? So this is again an example of civil war and infertility in Lebanon. This is again an unmatched case control study. We have cases of infertility cases and controls who are fertile. We wanted to look at whether the exposure to war is related to infertility. We took residents having a residence near bombing site. And again, the odds of exposure among the cases, if we do it together, this is odds of exposure among the cases. So how many were exposed among the cases? 68 out of? No, don't do it. It's odds. It's not a probability. We're taking odds and case control. So 68 over 46. And what's the odds of exposure among control? 49 over 51. So this is the odds. What's the odds ratio? Is the ratio of these odds, which is 1.54. So this means that cases, okay, have a 1.54 greater odds of being exposed compared to controls, because we're looking at odds of exposure among cases compared to odds of exposure cases controls. So is it significant? We do a test, and the P is 0.131. Is it significant? Looking at the P, if it's significant, it should be less than 0.0, at least 5. And if we look also at the 95% confidence interval, it includes 1. Is it significant? It's not significant. So this is just another example for you to look at if you want. And I will share with you the slides, yes, of course. So sample size and power of the study, how large should my sample be? Well, it depends. It depends how much money you have, how much the exposure is prevalent among the control. You have so many things. I provided you with a formula that you can use. But believe me, what you need, look what you need. So this is a research study to assess the relation between smoking and fracture. So you need the prevalence of vertebral fracture in the general population. You need to estimate what's the minimum odds ratio that you expect. And when you do a study, okay, to ascertain that smoking is related to fracture, you expect a certain relationship. What's the minimum expected relationship that you anticipate? So you wouldn't do a study if you don't expect some kind of a difference or an odds. So what's the odds, the minimum odd that you expect? So you have to first say what's the prevalence of the exposure in the population, what's the minimum effect that you anticipate, which is here is 2, the OR of 2. At which significant level we are talking about? What's a type 1 error, we call it, 5 level. And what's the power? Very important to talk about power, because when you do an analytical type of survey, not a descriptive one, you want power enough to find that odds ratio of 2. So you don't only have the type 1, you have type 2, and the power is 1 minus type 2, which is 80%. So you want to be 80% sure that you would find the minimum odds ratio of 2. This being said, you just replace in the formula, and you can always go to a website, say sample size calculation, say that you're doing case control study, and then you have to put in all these numbers. Okay, but at least just to know what is it, you need to specify the power, you need to specify the type 1, either the difference or the OR. Okay, so either the difference between your cases and control or a minimum OR that you maybe have read in the literature about. And then, so this is it. So you find this relationship. So you find the relationship, sorry. So what's next? If you want to have the relationship, the estimate, the adjusted estimate is to adjust for confounder. Okay, so how to adjust for confounder? What is it, a confounder? A confounder is, we know that it is associated with the outcome. Okay, so we know that the older the person, the more likely that he will get bladder cancer. Age could be as well associated with smoking. The age is not related to smoking. It's not like it does cause smoking. It's usually older people tend to smoke more. Is that a causal association? No. So if a variable is causally associated with your outcome and associated with your exposure, this is called a confounder. So how to address confounder? We match. If you match, in the design, so you can do it in the design or in the analysis. And the design, if you match, you take care of some of the confounder, not all of the confounder. So the variable you matched on will be controlled for. Another way of doing it is, and this is something that I did not put, is to restrict your population, your cases, let's say to male. So if you want to control for gender, instead of matching for gender, you can only take male. So restricting with a particular group is a sort of controlling for the confounder. Stratified analysis, meaning that if you suspect that gender is a potential confounder, I can present my data stratified by gender. This means that I do an analysis for males alone and for females alone, and then I compare. And we call them, we produce or we compute stratum-specific odds ratio. So for every group, for every stratum, what's the stratum is the category of the confounder. So if I have two categories of the confounder, male, female, for male an OR and the female OR. And then I can do some aggregate measure that we call mental Hansel odds ratio. This is a little bit less. It's okay. So if the OR are, let me not confuse you with this, but this is something that you read, which is an aggregate measure. So when you average the OR, so you have male, let's say OR of 2, and the female an OR of 2.5, and they're not very different. Okay, the 2 and the 2.5, and you want to produce one, you just do like an average. We call mental Hansel odds ratio. And the third way of dealing with confounder is through the analysis by doing multivariate analysis and coming up with adjusted OR. So the OR in a 2 by 2 table is called crude OR, is called unadjusted OR. This is not accounted for control variable or confounders. When you do multivariate analysis, every single OR would be controlled for all other variables that are in the regression analysis. For case control study, we have logistic regression. It models the OR, the log of the odds. It is unconditional logistic regression when you have an unmatched. It's the conditional logistic regression when you have matched analysis. Just be careful and read about it. Again, just quickly, in terms of selection of cases prevalent versus incidence, use incident as much as possible, avoid prevalent cases. The golden rule for the selection of control is that the control should represent the prevalence of the exposure in the control should represent that in the general population, and you shouldn't be picking up controls whose being included, whenever you select cases or control, the way you select them should be independent of the exposure status. So you wouldn't go and pick up non-smokers. If you want to do a control, you don't go look for non-smoker. You look for people of the general population that could be smoker or non-smoker. So that's why you don't look for smokers. Be careful, you need to always ascertain the case through standard measure, objective measure, and people, replicable measure, replicable method, and assessment of the exposure usually done consistently among cases and control. Let me give you the last example. If you're taking people who have renal cancer and you want to look at urinary tract infection, and you take controls from the general population, the way you can ascertain urinary tract infection for somebody who have urinary cancer, is through medical records. Like if they have any, if they had any time, they have urine analysis, etc. And then, but if you go to the general population, how would you ascertain whether they ever had urinary tract infection, which is an exposure? You would ask, have you ever had a urinary tract infection? But many of these urinary tract infections, they go without any symptoms. So you can't have, if you are assessing urinary tract infection using self-report in the control, use a self-report in the case. So don't get the information for the case from the medical record while taking it as self-reported data from the control. So always be consistent in the way you assess exposure in cases and controls. And last but not least, we have a variant for case control study which is called nested case control study. And this is, it's a hybrid type of design. So let's say we have a large cohort study ongoing, and then as the researcher follows up on the participants. So your cohort start with exposed and exposed. People don't have the disease. In a cohort study, people, the baseline, they don't have the disease. And the research, but we know that some of them are exposed, some of them are not exposed. And people follow them up for 10, 20 years. So what we can do is, before the end of the follow-up, if some of the people develop the disease, we take them as cases. Okay? The follow-up period did not end yet. So we take whoever developed the cases, that's the disease after 2 years, and we find controls among those who are in the cohort who didn't yet develop, because some of them might develop later. But after 2 years, if I have 100, I select from all the remaining ones who are still healthy as controls, and I compare them. So we call them nested case control study. What's the advantage of a nested case control study is that the ascertainment of the exposure is done independent of the disease, because at the time we collected data on the exposure, people were not diseased. So I go to them at time 0, do you smoke? Don't you smoke? But I know that they don't have the disease. As they move on, they develop. But where do I get my data on the exposure? From baseline, which is collected independent before the disease has developed. Another example is the recall. So you take care of the recall, you take care of also the selection, that it's not actually related to the disease. So particularly is an advantage over the regular case control study. Okay, so the recall bias is eliminated, the exposure data are more likely to represent pre-illness, the cost is reduced, and instead of waiting to all the people to develop, or some of them until the end of the cohort, we do a nested case control study. And of course, the case and the control are from the same population. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.